being an extrovert, I have no problem walking up to complete strangers and asking them intricate details of their lives. So what I do is every time I see somebody wearing a hat that is Air Force or Navy or whatever, especially the World War II guys, is I'll chat them up and I'll ask them a very specific question, which is, what is something about your job that you wouldn't know unless you did it? And they always tell me something that's really awesome.
Welcome to the Military Science Fiction Podcast. We're four veterans who are crazy enough to become writers, and we're here to talk about what makes great military science fiction. The greatest niche within a niche of any fiction. More niche than the Coast Guard, or the Space Force. On board is Rick Partlow, author of more than 70 novels, including Contact Front and the Drop Trooper series, Jeffery H. Haskell, author of the Grimm's War series, as well as the Wraith and Arsenal superhero series, Josh Hayes, author of the Valor series, and operations manager and head of thriller acquisitions for Aethon Books, and I'm James S. Aaron, author of the Aeon 14, Sentience Wars, and Galactic Law series. Between the four of us, we bring more than 100 novels written, most of that is Rick, more than 30 years publishing experience, and on the military side, we'd be retired by now if any of us had stuck around. Join our Discord server to tell us how much you love us.
Today we're talking about what is military sci-fi and how it differs from science fiction that has people in the military in it, but aren't the main characters, right?
Yes. Well, we figured
this is a pet peeve of mine because more than half of what is in the military sci-fi section on Amazon and in the bookstores is not military sci-fi.
Well, why don't we start then? Give your idea of what military sci-fi is. Why don't we go?
Military sci-fi is about people in the military and how they deal with technology in the future and warfare and how it evolves. And it's pretty simple. If your main character is in the military and it's about them being in the military, then it's military sci-fi. If it's not, then it's, if it's a romance or if it's whatever the story is about is what the genre you're in. So if you're a spy and it's a thriller, and it's about the thrills of being a spy, then it's a thriller. And if it's about being in the military, then it's a military book. But the romance novels that there's this author and she's wonderful. She's a wonderful woman. I just adore her. And she writes these Wounded Ranch stories. And I consulted on it for her with ranks and things like that. And I was like, just make sure you don't call this a military novel. And she's like, oh, no. It's a romance novel. They just happen to be in the military.
But Amazon probably puts it in the military. You don't get to choose where they put you.
And that's part of the problem.
Yeah, it's always that borderline between I want Amazon to police the categories and I don't want Amazon to police the categories.
Well, you can choose your categories, but sometimes they get cross-pollinated just based on Autobots and buying habits.
Or people put their books in categories they don't belong in because they think that will help them sell more books. When in reality, it's the opposite.
Well, and some people will put their books in categories that their books wouldn't be in because those categories are published not as often in, and so they can get the bestseller tags easier,
right?
Because they aren't in a bigger genre, which is kind of gaming the system, but that's not part of our conversation today.
Like my first Wholesale Slaughter book was the #1 in metaphysical science fiction.
Right.
A book about giant piloted robots is metaphysical.
Well, it's an existential crisis. Why are giant robots better than tanks?
Exactly.
It's a question that has to be answered.
Yes.
I did answer it actually.
How about you, James? What is military sci-fi for you?
I agree with you. I think it's a story where the characters are in the military. I do enjoy stories that don't always have to be about the experience of being in the military, which are pretty hard to find. I think usually they're going to be tied, the question also, should it be tied around some kind of campaign or a battle or what? In fact, I can't really think of any examples on the top of my head. I can think of a lot more in the regular, like out of World War II in Vietnam, like stories about, mechanics or doctors or, things of that nature, where it's still definitely a military story. Um, but I would agree, like I'm thinking of Battlestar Galactica in particular. Like Battlestar Galactica is a good example, I think, of a story where most of the characters are in the military, but then you also have other outside characters. Like that one's going to be almost cross genre in that respect, where they can jump between and show different things about the military experience and then the civilian experience, outside of the military,
But it's
which,
all highlighted
yeah,
by the military experience, right? Because
right.
most of the viewpoint characters are Starbuck, Apollo, Adama. They're
Mm,
all in the military, so to speak.
yeah.
Even though their discipline was just awful.
Atrocious.
My
Yeah.
favorite character in Battlestar, though, was the guy who went on to go on and be in The Expanse and basically played the same character,
Hmm.
um, which is the engineer guy who, the psychopath in
Oh, that's right.
Expanse.
Amos.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Amos.
Amos.
Amos. Yeah, I love him.
Amos is the best thing about The Expanse. I just rewatched that whole series, actually.
He's the best character.
I love those kind of characters.
I am that
Jane
guy.
from Firefly, it's
Yeah.
That's the best line in the whole series is I am that guy.
Right.
the 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 thing though that really got me about Battlestar that I hated was I wouldn't call Battlestar military sci-fi because the emphasis was not on their struggles as a
Mm,
military fighting the Cylons. It was the emphasis was on the Cylons and who was sleeping with them.
right.
And you know, that just like episode 4 when it opened with Starbuck having sex with the bad guy, I was like, I'm done with this show. You just ruined my favorite character, and this just no, I'm done.
Well, that's what I was
And
thinking about because like the first episode is so tense where they're fighting,
it
they're
was so good.
a
Yeah.
military problem. They have to jump every, what is it, like 7 minutes, or the Cylons find them, and they're using the tools that they have, which is, the Galactica being an old ship, like all those tropes there, which I think for me tie into great military science fiction. Like that is the other thing. Like you might not have the hottest, greatest technology. You have the tools you have, you understand how to use them, and you apply them to the problem, the situation at hand, which is the military problem, right? Which I guess for me that would get to it, like the military problem in the story, and are we using military methods to advance the plot and grow the characters and things like that. So
And
Yeah,
whenever
I
I
mean
talk to
that's.
people, oh, go ahead, Josh.
I was just gonna say that might be the um, a good area of conversation, just because I look at Battlestar as military sci-fi, even with all the rest of the stuff thrown in, because it encapsulates the characters as a total person and not just them in the military, because they did deal with other struggles. There were like civilians and stuff in the show, but predominantly they were mostly all the military people. And not only did they have to deal with all of the military situations, the fighting and the rank issues that plagued a couple of episodes, all of that things, and like we said, the military bearing at many points was not there. But you got I think, a good blend of uh, a dive into the military life as it was for them, and then also saw those characters as people, as opposed to just rank and file numbers in their job and doing all of that. And um, the I thought the military aspect was done really well, even with all the military bearing stuff and maybe some strange tactics here and there. But I enjoyed it. I really did. I've watched the whole series all the way through. It got kind of hokey at the last part of the last season, when they started bringing in a whole bunch of kind of spiritual stuff, um, um, which I didn't really like. But if I took my if I stepped aside from it and just enjoyed it for what it was and what they were trying to do in the show, and kind of the metaphysical, kind of theological background of what they were trying to do, I actually liked it a lot better the second time, just because I was anticipating that coming and I could see why they were doing it. I really, that's one of my favorite military sci-fi shows that's been done in the last well, what did it came out in the early 90s, so the last couple of decades.
It was
The
2000.
early 90s?
It was 2004. You're right.
2006 is when the movie
2000
came out.
Yeah. So, well, still a couple decades.
Yeah, I mean, it started in 2006 with the miniseries or movie or whatever, and then they
I think it was
reboot the series.
2004 that the miniseries came out.
Was it 2004 it came out?
Yeah,
Yeah.
2004. Yeah. Anyway, I agree with James and Jeff as well on the Mill sci-fi stuff. There are a lot of more books than more sci-fi books with military in them than actual straight military sci-fi books. I can think of, an example of military sci-fi for me would be like the David Weber Honor Harrington series, which again, kind of like Battlestar in this way, you got a lot of predominantly military setting and operation and all of that, but you still, you could follow Honor in her personal life. There were other characters that you could follow doing things that weren't directly related to the military, which I think
A lot of political machinations too.
yeah, for sure. And I think that the combination of those, if used correctly in the right elements, still lend a book to being mill sci-fi. With sci-fi with military in it, I've done that. I've done both. I've done military sci-fi and sci-fi with military in it. I think the readers of mill sci-fi read mill sci-fi for what it is and what they know that it is. The readers of sci-fi with military will read both, but they'll be a lot more forgiving, especially in the sci-fi with military in it, because in that,
Well, they're reading it for different reasons.
well, they're reading it for different reasons, but they're not as knowledgeable as, like, say, veterans or people in the military when they read something about a tactic or something about weapons or something like that. If they see that something is wrong or maybe not accurate tactically speaking, they're not gonna immediately think that's not how they're gonna do things and then be disappointed with the book. A reader that is reading mill sci-fi for the mill sci-fi, if he reads a sci-fi book with military in it, he's going to see a lot of the things that the other readers won't, or he or she, and they'll be, I think, a lot more critical of that.
So let me ask this question. Like if I wrote a story about a future car salesman who just preys on soldiers outside the post, like getting 24% interest rates, is that military sci-fi? Because it's
Hell, 24% would be good today.
Definitely military sci-fi. And then the first sergeant's going to get mad.
Right.
I told I met somebody at Dragon Con and she was a helicopter Apache pilot. And she was writing some hoo-ha science fiction for Bain. And I was like, why aren't you writing about, a search and rescue pilot in the future or attack ground, air to ground, pilot in the future? And she's like, nobody wants to read that. And I'm like, are you kidding me?
Mm-hmm.
The thing is like the market is predominantly infantry and power armor based, but that's just because that's what everybody writes. That's not because that's what everybody wants to read.
Right.
Honor Harrington is not infantry or powered armor base.
Yep.
I know.
Well, and I think too that
but that's not Honor's not in the indie market, and there are only 16 books over 30 years.
I know, but I'm just saying
yeah.
Honor Harrington is like a huge. It's got its own conventions for it, and people dress up as the characters in parades. So it's not.
I think the big reason we're seeing this like influx of infantry and even power armor, I guess, out of seeing that as like advanced infantry, it's because Iraq and Afghanistan were primarily infantry wars. People didn't get to see the stories of the Navy or the Air Force or the whole combined, like a bit of combined arms, but not the way World War II kind of incites the imagination.
It wasn't an asymmetrical war,
Yeah.
or it was an asymmetrical war. It was
Right.
and there's a huge demand, I think, anyways, for stuff beyond just the main character's infantry. Kevin Eikenberry is writing his tanker series, and I think that's going to be awesome.
I think the demand is there, but like you mentioned, the air rescue kind of helicopter pilot and her story, kind of like with Valor, that story is interesting, and there are readers that are craving that type of story, but the overall market tends to not be that. And so if you're writing a book to sell to a big audience, those are things you have to take into account when you're
Well, yeah, but you got to overlap them, right? So,
Oh
like,
no, I agree,
know,
100%. Yeah.
I feel
Uh,
like the reason that infantry stories are more popular is because it's hard to write a not even realistic, even like semi-realistic, uh, spaceship story that doesn't have the realistic part, which is hours and days of sheer boredom
Right.
with just seconds of combat. Whereas the infantry, at least you're like down there slogging along someplace strange, and you can describe the locals, the surroundings, all that, the politics. But if you're in a starship, well, you're in a starship and you're waiting for little dots on a screen to get close enough to shoot at them.
well, and I think too
Yeah.
the infantry
yeah,
base or
that sounds
squad
terrible.
the squad based books, as opposed to like space navies. And Jeff, you've actually done a good job with space navies, and presenting combat in a good way, especially in the first book, at the end where you're swapping between POVs between the enemy ships and Grimm's ship, and doing that in kind of the way that, like Tom Clancy did in Hunt for October, when he was like jumping between multiple
It
ships.
builds tension. Yeah.
It builds tension, and it's good. That the reason I think a lot of people like this small squad based is you get a lot more personal connection with the characters, and it's not just a following 1,500 troops on a maneuver, and overtaking a
But
city, which
you also have infantry stuff in your books, Jeff.
A little bit, yeah.
yeah,
Well, I think
I think
you
a good blend is
But again, it's a blend, right? So
Right.
that's what I was saying. I was saying if you did pararescue pilot, orbit to ground pararescue pilot, then you would have a blend of, it wouldn't just be purely like, let me do my PMCS on my plane for 180 pages and then 5 pages of rescue. You would have a blend of it, and I think you could do it well enough that people
Well,
who read
you'd have to get that person in a position where they're doing something extraordinary, not
well, I
just
mean,
their.
that's all main characters.
I know, but I'm saying that if you're talking about like their experience in a war, the vast majority of pararescue people will do certain things over and over the same way. But if you want to make that your central character and that your central theme, something's going to have to happen. Like they're going to have to get
Yeah,
cut
but
off.
you're
They're gonna have
describing
to-
every main character ever.
Eh,
I
well,
mean,
not every character.
when I was in the army, you do the same thing over and over and over again. Months of boredom followed by 30 seconds of sheer terror. I mean, we all have been through that.
That is true, but the thing I was saying though was if you're describing infantry on a planet, even though you're not doing anything action wise at the time, you can still get into the place you're at. The politics, the civilians dealing with
Well, and that's, I mean, that's where a well-rounded book comes in. You multiple POVs, or you have, enough
Yeah,
characters
but
that
we
you
were
can.
just talking about why more people write about infantry than that other stuff. And it's probably because it's easier to make an interesting story. If you're going to do those others, you have to really work hard and bring a lot of stuff in to make it an interesting story that you want to tell and people want to read. Whereas with infantry, it's probably simpler. That's probably why
Yeah.
you get more people doing that.
Yeah,
I'll
I
give you
just
that.
didn't want to insult the infantry officer by saying what he wrote was easier.
It's not. It's easier.
Honestly, we have to insult the officer no matter what. To
You
be
were an
fair
officer,
to our
you were an officer, weren't you, James?
to be fair to our
This was
listeners,
infantry.
James is the only hoity-toity officer in the group. The rest of us are just grunts,
Oh,
basically.
no, I was an
No,
officer.
Rick was an
Rick was-
officer.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's right. I'm sorry.
Rick
Yeah.
was an infantry officer, and James was a Patriot battery officer.
Yeah, I was there to defend. Well, I was enlisted first. I was a medic, and then I was.
You're a Mustang.
No.
No, I was a medic. I did 91 Bravo and inpatient psych, which was like a thing they did away with. But yeah, then I like ROTC paid for school, so I ended up in air defense because if you put air defense like anywhere on your list, it was like for me it was like number 5. You're getting air defense. So
So
That's what I
so
did.
did you get out and go to school and then ROTC?
no, I enlisted. I was in the reserves. I applied. Like my guidance counselor in school was so awesome that the only thing I ever heard about was joining the army to help pay for college. And then I did the early, whatever, before I went to basic. I'm talking to a guy at the Reserve Center, and he's like, "Oh yeah, you want to go to college? You should look at ROTC." Huh? What's that? And so I go back to my guidance counselor, and oh yeah, that would be good for you. And so I applied for that, and I had to actually do my interview while I was at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri, and
Oh, well,
that was a mess because I was like, this first lieutenant like helped me put my uniform together. Like I never even had my greens, like they were still brand new, right? And they're all jacked up. He's putting like pressing stuff in with his thumbs, and I go into a room with like two lieutenant colonels and a major, which was like more rank than I'd ever seen in my life. And yeah, it was good, but that was how I mean I guess I spent 4 years enlisted and 8 um as an officer. So but I got to do all the I guess more of the formative stuff, you know, platoon leader, battery command, that kind of thing.
My dad probably has the most interesting, well, maybe not the most interesting, but the most colorful military career of anybody that I know. He ended as a chaplain in the Army, but he started as a bosun's mate in the Navy and was in the Navy during Vietnam, but wasn't actually stationed in Vietnam. They got stationed on a new destroyer, and so they most of their time was spent in preliminary sailing and just kind of perimeter, operations, that kind of thing. And then he got out of the Navy and went into the Air Force Reserve and went to seminary. And he was enlisted in the Air Force, and then went was going to go to officer school for the Air Force, but they didn't have any chaplain slots in the Air Force at the time, and so he went blue to green and went in the Army, and was in he retired as a major, and he kept getting passed over for lieutenant colonel because in the chaplain, they're not field grade or company grade or whatever it is. They're not in that in a big MOS that needs a lot of officers. And so he kept getting passed over. And finally, when he retired, he did 33 years total military service. Finally, when he retired, the next year, the second Desert Storm kicked off. And they were like, "Hey, do you want to come back?" And he's like, "Are you going to give me lieutenant colonel?" And they were like, "No." And he's like, "Then go pound sand because I'm not coming back."
Man, in air defense, that was how they kept you in. Like every time you get to a point where like you're at 20, I mean, actually they do it right at like 18. Like, you know, if you made major, right at 18 is when they dangle lieutenant colonel in front of you. And,
Mhm.
you know, if you want to, and then colonel.
See,
But
that's
you're
great
right.
fodder for a book because like a lot of what Grimm's War revolves around is the main character trying to get promoted
Mhm.
before he ages out and they muster him.
Yep.
Yeah.
I know
See,
with enlisted, one of my good friends when I was in the army, he was a spec 4 at 8 years. He just really liked being a specialist.
Right.
He loved his job. He did not want to be a sergeant. And they're like, listen, you go sergeant or you're out. And you don't have to be you're doing a combat, mission for there to be tension and excitement and action.
For sure.
Um,
I'll tell you, your dad, Josh, and you, James, got out just in time because I think something happens to people when they make colonel.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I
Well,
actually had the
I
exact opposite experience of like getting uh promotions dangled in front of me to keep me in because I was an E5 when I got out, and I turned down testing for E6 tech sergeant because I knew I was going to pass and I knew they were going to promote me. And I also turned down canine school as an E3, or no, an E4. I turned down canine school uh, right before I got promoted to staff sergeant because I knew they were going to make me extend. And I was so done. I was like, I wanted to get out. And I knew that if I had done either one of those two things, I would have stayed in.
Canine
And
school would
then
have been cool.
canine school would have been awesome. There was a female that got accepted to canine school right when I turned mine down. She got accepted, and then she went on to be on the president's detail, and then she went into the officer program and made officer and all that. But you're right. You said it earlier. If I would have stayed in, I would have been retired last year at 20 years. Probably would have gone out as an E8. I would assume. I don't know that I would have ever made E9, but I did very well in the military. I just did not like where I was at, and that's part of I think something that I haven't seen a lot in mil sci-fi, only because it doesn't happen very often. Is when I got stationed at a nuke missile base in Wyoming, and something that a lot of non-military people, even some vets, don't understand is when you're working around nukes. And so this would probably apply to a lot of the military sci-fi that we do, just because based on the weapon systems, the engine systems, and all of that. When you work around nukes, you have to have a secret clearance, which I had, and then you also have to have a secret crypto for the access to the sites. But you also have to have what's called PRP, which is Personal Reliability Program. And when you're on that program, you cannot take certain prescription medications or certain off-the-counter medications. You can't, like, for instance, one of the big things is you can't be hypnotized. Like if you're going to quit smoking, that was big in the 2000s. You cannot be hypnotized. And if you are hypnotized or you happen to take a medication that is not authorized or you have surgery, then you get dropped off of PRP, mostly temporarily. And that means you can't work around nukes if you're not certified. And then after you're done with your surgery or whatever, you have to be recertified and then you can work again. And so there are multiple levels of security programs around those type of things. And then once you get your secret clearance and your PRP, you're stuck. And I knew guys at that nuke missile base that had been there for 12 years. And I knew guys that after I got out were still there like 8 years later working nuke missiles, because it's so difficult to keep people certified under PRP. But the secret clearance, even though it's not top secret, it's still
hard to get,
somewhat difficult to get, and it takes a long time. I mean, this guy, when he came and did my interview, he was talking, he brought up people that I hadn't seen in like 12 years that I didn't even remember their names. And he was, this was your neighbor at so and so, and I was like, really? That was my, I had absolutely no idea, but whatever. And I know that, you know, a lot of the things in military science fiction don't go into that nitty-gritty detail, but those are the kind of details that if you're writing mil sci-fi for that audience, those are the details that those readers are going to respect and identify with, that most readers won't. And if you get them right, you're going to garner a huge readership in that, because those people that read that go, I knew that this was a thing, and most authors don't include this in your books, they're going to tell their military friends that are looking for that type of realism, or just those little small elements that you get right. And that's really going to do well for you as a mil sci-fi author.
Rick, I think it was book 4 of Drop Trooper that you had him go on that secret mission where he hijacked the shuttle, the alien shuttle.
I think that was book 2.
Book 2. And I remember somewhere along the line, someone asking him about it, and he was like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I always thought that was really cool, because I had a secret clearance because I worked with Singars. And, you know, you'd always get people who were asking you questions about the radios or whatever, you know, and you'd be like, you know,
yep,
I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't recall that conversation, sir.
Yeah.
I thought that was really cool
in that book too, he tries to find out what he can about how the ships transition in and out of systems, and he gets in trouble with military intelligence because he's just asking questions.
Yep. Yeah, I thought that was really cool.
Well, and there's certain things, and you guys know this too, there's certain things in the military, even when you're in the military, that you can't know. You know, there was things working around nuke missiles where there were other cops that did other jobs that couldn't tell me, even though I had a secret clearance and even though I had crypto and PRP and all that. There were elements of their job and what they did that they couldn't tell me about.
Yeah, and your clearance is only valid to your field, like you know, to what you need to know, so to speak. So when I was on the radar with the radios, I had the secret clearance, but it wasn't like I could walk in anywhere and demand secret information.
100%, yeah. And
I have in book 3 they go on in Grimm book 3 they go on a secret mission, and later on they can't even discuss the mission amongst themselves, the people who were there.
Yep.
Like Grimm gets a medal and he doesn't even know what it's for, because the part of the mission that earned the medal wasn't one he was privy to. And I had a couple people like, how did you know that's how it works? And I'm like, well, I do my research and I pay attention, you know.
For sure.
But the whole military life, especially if you're just basically taking the modern military and your military experience, putting it in the future, like Josh said, there's those little details that really make people happy. You know, the details of the uniforms and the you know, I call it the minutia. You know, you were saying, Rick, how do you make it interesting on a ship? Well, like, I enjoy the minutia of the day-to-day life of the ship. Like, what are they doing what's going on in the rec room? You know, what are they working on in engineering? What are they eating? You know, that kind of thing. And it sounds mundane, but when you are encapsulating it within the ship where this is their lives, and at any moment they could be going into battle, it all adds to the flavor of the story and draws people in to really love the characters. The
One thing I
same way
enjoyed. Oh, go
that,
ahead.
you know, planets do, or the new barracks or your new base or your new armor does for infantry.
Well, you also do that through the lens of Grimm as an officer that wants to be interested in, you know, his people's lives, and he's thinking about the whole ship. And so you're doing it through a military lens of encapsulating, you know, again, coming back to like the idea of the military problem, like he's got it, his ship's got to run well. He's thinking about his people, developing his people. Do I have enough resources? Do I have enough time? Do I have, you know, can I do the things I need to do? And so you're getting all these cool character elements while presenting it through the lens of it's a military, you know, we're on an operation, or even if we're just conducting patrol, like the ship is still, it's a weapon system that has to operate. And I think that's always an interesting way of doing things. He's not, I mean, yeah, the guy has, you know, thinks about sex and stuff sometimes, but actually Grimm, not that much. But he's constantly focused on his mission and thinking about how and what the things around him affect that, which is kind of creates a tension that drives the story forward as I think about it.
And one of the things I liked about Grimm was that I mean, with any commander, you've got a lot of things that you got to deal with, but it wasn't that you made him stress about the right things and gave him internal struggle in even giving orders that he knew were right. And you know, a lot of commanders get kind of cardboard cutout, like just go and do your job type thing, and this is our responsibility, which is true. But I think giving them that personal challenge of this is what needs to be, this is what needs to happen. And but I don't, I'm not comfortable, or I hate that I have to make this decision or order this person to go do that. And those kind of internal personal struggles are really, like what James said, really build that tension in any kind of situation. Even like with Grimm, he takes suggestions and ideas from his subordinates, which I think is integral in any good command situation, where they're not just making a decision. Like sometimes he can't, and sometimes there are situations where people just have to do what he says. But I think and I think we all could all agree that good military leaders don't automatically discount suggestions from their subordinates, even if those suggestions kind of counteract or not in line with what they were originally thinking. And kind of brings me to my next point, and maybe something we could talk about just for a minute, is one of the things that some people in their military science fiction get wrong, which I think is really kind of a crazy thing to get wrong, in my opinion, is the time and place aspect of conversation between multiple ranks, but also the way in which, in a critical situation or even just a standard operating procedure, where an enlisted or even just a junior officer addresses the senior officer or the captain of a ship. I've read a couple of books where maybe a first lieutenant or a second lieutenant, however their ranking structure works, will address the captain in kind of a nonchalant way. And in one of the examples, it's a very critical situation where the ship is going into combat, and the captain or the officer in charge is giving orders, and the lieutenant turns around and goes, "I don't think that's a good idea." Something along, I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah,
And
yeah. I've read something like that too. Yeah.
yeah, and or are you sure, or that kind of thing. And especially in a critical situation, that just doesn't happen. And you know, you always, in that type of situation, default to yes. And then if there is like say an XO has a critical thing to say about the captain's decision, that is not handled in front of the crew. It's not even handled in front of other officers. You find a time where you can converse with your captain and say, "I'm not sure that I agreed with your decision here," um, and handle it that way, instead of having that. You know, they do it for conflict, right?
Right.
Easy, simple conflict where
Drama for
they're,
drama's sake.
yeah, and
Yeah.
that's not at all how it happens.
Or
And
they they do it without realizing the narrative doesn't realize it's bad, right? Like if
Yes.
you're on a ship and your command structure is such, or if you're an infantry platoon and your command structure is such that the people below you in combat are questioning your orders, something has gone seriously wrong.
100%.
And but the narrative doesn't treat it like that. They treat it like that's just normal, and then
Right.
that totally breaks what does Scott always call it, maximum capacity.
Right.
But it breaks that illusion of where you're at, and it's yeah. I've read a couple of books like that, and I'm just like I want to
It's
like
kind of
this book, but
the fascination with operators that we have right now, like getting back to our conversation about the way, like different types of military. Like I think of my experience really of the Army. Like I transitioned out of the Army as Iraq, in the second year of Iraq. But I came up in a Cold War Army, like just like Josh is going through with the nukes. Like these are serious things that have to be done by serious people, and there's no place for, like, if you're not going to be doing a serious job in the right way, you're out, and
Yeah.
people don't. But we've been kind of like the last 20 years has been all these stories of like, rogue operators out there in the desert with beards, and that's all cool, but that's not, for me, that's not
this
what
is like
builds.
the top of the top of the top of the top.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
yeah, the Delta Force guy gets to say, "This is my safety captain,"
Right. Right.
Yeah.
because he's Delta Force, and there's what 24 of them, you know.
Right. But
There's
now
more than
people think
that.
that's how the military operates,
Yeah, but the
Yeah.
regular military, you'd be like, "Yes, sir. Yes, Captain, sir. Whatever you say, sir.
Right.
I'll put the safety on right now."
And then the captain's like, "Oh
Unless
crap."
you're a warrant officer.
That's your
Yeah.
warrant officer.
Well,
And
we did
then
like
you'd
I
say
love
yes, sir. Then you'd say yes, sir, and then ignore him.
Yeah.
come here, Captain. Come here. Can I talk to you for a
Yeah.
second? I
Right.
love warrant officers. So Rick, we glossed over and didn't give you a chance to define military science fiction as you see it. So do you want to jump in?
That's always a danger when Josh and Jeff are in a podcast.
Yo, I'm so sorry.
um, military science fiction for me is it's like that Supreme Court definition of porn. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it.
Nice.
When you read military science fiction as opposed to science fiction that happens to have military people in it, I feel it's not as much what it's about as the mindset of the people in the book. I mean, there's, anybody who's been in the military knows there's a certain way you look at things, and you're looking at things differently than if you're writing a book and it's about explorers or politicians. If you're in the military, you see things as work that has to get done or threats that have to be dealt with. You're not going into things looking at it like Captain Kirk. I have to meet this new race and establish relations with them. You're looking at like, okay, this is a threat. How will we deal with this if establish relations? Yeah, I got that. How will we deal with this if we're attacked? You're looking at things in a different way. And I think if the main characters are dealing with things that way, then it's more military science fiction. But I mean, there's a lot of overlap. It's a sliding scale. I've written books that are just pure military science fiction, and I've written books in the same series that are space opera with military stuff in them. It's people are pretty flexible, I think, when it comes to what they expect from military science fiction. I think if you give them the military details they want and the way of thinking that they recognize from their own experience in the military, that you can squeeze a lot of other things in there that are more space opera-ish.
Well, Rebecca always tells me, my wife always says that like your book should have humor in it. That doesn't make it a humorous book because humor is part of life.
Yeah.
My book Grim has a love interest, and she just happens to be a spy, and there's usually a side arc with her being a spy. It doesn't make it a thriller. It's still military sci-fi. It just also has all aspects of life in it, and that all books should be like that. Drop Trooper, he has a relationship with that girl in Drop Trooper. And then when he gets sent to officer school, and there's all that nonsense going on at officer school that you did really well, where it was like there was like some behind the scenes drama at officer school that the main character wasn't even privy to. He was just sort of getting the backlash from it. You should have everything in your books. You should have humor. You should have romance. You should have the thrills and chills, and there should be horror elements. you're writing a well-rounded book if that's the case. But there's always going to be, it's like when people say like, well, my book doesn't have a main character. Well, then you're not really writing a story. You're writing a collection of vignettes. You know, your book has a focus and your book has a main character. Does that mean it can't have other characters and it can't do other things? No, of course not.
I agree, and I think the main character aspect, you can have multiple main characters, but you have to have some central character that the readers are going to latch onto. And if you don't have that, then you haven't really narrowed down what you want to do in your book or in your story. And just like, I know this isn't strictly speaking military sci-fi, but in Game of Thrones, there isn't one single main character in that book, but there are multiple main characters that readers
And they're
identify
all
with,
going to die.
and they're all going to die.
Well, as I'm fond of telling people, you're not George Martin, so I mean,
I know.
Well,
but it's funny how people still wanted to create main characters to the point where Jon Snow and Khaleesi, whatever that actor name is,
Ed Stark,
yeah,
kill the guy beheaded.
Yeah, Ned Stark. I guess that was the trope he subverted, though, was you really went into it thinking Ned was the main character, and then he kills Ned. And now the reader's just like, oh, what do I do? And
Ari Salvatore did that with his Demon Wars saga.
Yeah.
He created a ranger named Knight something, and the whole first book was about him. And I really liked the character. And at the end of the book, he gets killed. And then this other character who I didn't like at all becomes the main character. And I'm like, oh, well, I guess I'm done with your series.
One of the things I liked about the Honor Harrington series is obviously Honor Harrington is the main character, but there's so many other characters that you get to follow, that you get to, I mean, you grow with Honor through her career, which I think around book 9, it kind of takes off in its own direction, where it becomes more kind of a political thing than a strictly military thing. But there's so many characters that you get to follow through their career that aren't.
There's Scotty Tremaine, and there's
Tremaine, and 100%.
Yeah,
even during the, like, I think the first 6 or 7 books are my favorite, and I've read them multiple times. And even the Havenite military, where you get to follow Foraker and the Admiral and stuff. You get
the TAC Witch.
Yeah. And those are fun to do, but there is always at least one central character or a couple of central characters that you really need to know. Like, this is the character that the story is about, and I did that in Valor, where I had Jackson Fisher was the investigator, and he was the main character, but there were other characters in the book that were central to the plot that we got to see and follow through, and then those characters kind of carried through to the next couple of books.
One danger you have to think about when you're writing a book with a lot of different POV characters is you don't want to write a section where, because I've read many books like this where I'll get to the point where, oh, this is this character, I'm just going to skip this section because I don't like reading their
100%.
And that's obviously, as someone who writes multiple POVs, and has chapters that are not, from Grimm's point of view, one of the things you have to do when you're doing that is make those stories as exciting, as interesting, and as full of tension as the main story, so that you're not, and related to. So
definitely related.
I always try to bring everything together in the end, so that it's all, you don't feel like you're reading a completely different story within a story. It's not like it's not like there's a story happening. It's not like I put 2 books together that are completely separate stories. It should all be related.
And so while those characters don't use the same terms, maybe, I think they're still objective based. They're still solving problems. They're still working on things in a way that, while they're not using the same terms, like I was sitting there thinking, as you're talking about that, Jeff, like, well, what if you just like went off on a loop and had a character go do a romance plot or something? It's like, that's the kind of thing that makes me crazy. Because I just have no interest in it. Like, those stories don't appeal to me. So
you keep waiting for it to matter.
Right.
Yeah.
And you're like, when's this going to matter? And man, it drives me nuts when it doesn't matter.
A movie that I just watched just last night dealt with this kind of situation almost perfectly, in my opinion. It was The Equalizer 3. It's a Denzel Washington movie.
I haven't seen that yet. I love the first 2 though.
So, do you care about spoilers then? Because I'm about to spoil something in the movie.
Spoiler: Denzel Washington kills a lot of people.
If you care about that,
I'd rather not get spoiled, just because the twist in those movies is always so good.
I'll hold off on my spoiler deal, but there is a thing that happens in this movie. There's a character that's introduced, that is introduced for a reason, and you don't know what that reason is. You're like, in the back of my mind, I'm watching the movie and I'm like, why is this person important? What does it matter? Why specifically is it this person? And it's not until the very end of the movie, like literally the last 4 or 5 minutes of the movie, where everything connects.
Yeah, those
And
movies are great about that.
it's it's important to the characters, not to the plot. And so it was, which is a bit a distinction maybe we can get into with events on other shows, but this connection between the characters was so well done and very well presented that I finished the movie going, wow, that was super cool. And even though it wasn't a like a, a twist, something that happened and that changed the whole plot, it was so interesting because I cared about the characters. It was amazing. So watch it and see if you agree with me, because I thought it was really well done.
Yeah, well, yeah, yeah, definitely. So it's I watched the first one, and I love the ending of the first one where they pull back. Spoilers. Have you
Well,
guys
the
seen
first one's been out
spoiler?
for a while.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I know, but I just made a big deal about spoilers, and I don't want to be the one who spoils the. It's a great ending of that movie, though. You should absolutely watch it. And Antoine Fuqua is the director and often the writer, and he has a style like in Tears of the Sun
Yep.
that
Meaning
is
good.
a lot of how I write. You know, it's a lot of setup, a lot of build up, a lot of and then the action at the end is huge,
Mm-hmm.
and it takes a while, and I really like that. The whole which is weird because like I'll read reviews of my books. They'll be like, "Oh, this is a nonstop roller coaster of action," and I'm like, "Which book did you read?" Because I didn't write a nonstop roller coaster of action.
Hey, as long as they thought it was a nonstop roller coaster, that's whatever. You'll take it.
Long as it's not a roller coaster of love.
Yeah.
I have a friend who's reading books for Athon, and they uh, they sent him a couple of books, and they asked him if like just check to see if it was PG-13, and he sent me a message, and he's like, "Page 8, dude, page 8. It went from PG-13 to double X, on page 8."
Nice. I think one of the things for MIL sci-fi in general, for the genre, is if you're going to write in it, we actually talked about this a little bit before the show, and me specifically not reading some of the pillar
Founding.
books
The
of
seminal works.
the genre. Yeah. You mentioned not writing things that have been done to death, which is true. That's something, if you're going to write MIL sci-fi, you want to be knowledgeable about. But more to the point, if you're not a veteran or you don't have any experience in the military and you want to write MIL science fiction, I mean, not the same genre, but Tom Clancy wrote phenomenal military books and he never served in the military.
You just do a lot of research.
And that's what I'm saying. Like, if you're going to write these books and you really like the genre, read a lot in the genre, but also one of the things that I do for a lot of research for my books, even though I write MIL sci-fi, is I read and watch a lot of nonfiction military stuff, nonfiction military events. I listen to a lot of podcasts where the interviewer is talking to soldiers or Marines or SEALs or whatever, and it's not a writing podcast. It's just a podcast on their life and their experiences, and those will give you a lot of information that you didn't think you needed to write these books well, because they're coming directly from the mouths of the military people that experienced them. And so even if, like, for me, I was never a special operator. I never went on, capture kill missions or rescue missions or anything like that, but I've done enough research that I know what those people felt and thought in those situations. And so I feel that I can write accurately about them. And, one of the things that in Stryker's War, we read that Medal of Honor citation, and Stryker's War was based on a Medal of Honor recipient, Dakota Meyer, and his experience. And the the most the biggest comment I get about that book from most of the readers is that the end of the book, the very end, the letter that I wrote, for context, that every chapter starts with a line from this death letter that one of the two main characters wrote to his parents. And the book starts out with, "Mom, Dad, if you're reading this, then I died and I'm not coming home." But I never say who the letter is from until obviously the end of the book when you figure out which character died. And then what I did was I wrote my own medal citation, and I presented that in the ceremony at the end of the book. And then I compiled all the bits of the letter and put that at the end of the book. And the biggest thing I get from that is when they read the honor certificate, when they read the order for the award and then the letter, I cried. The readers say that, and I go, absolutely, that is the coolest thing, because they didn't cry because it was sad, which it is. They cried because they knew or had experience with someone who had done something like that, who had received an award like that, and they had been in that ceremony, and they had stood there while the order was being read, and it connected with them on a deep, deep level. And that was something that I didn't do purposefully, but I did it. I took so much time and effort to craft the order and to craft the letter in such a way that I knew that people reading it wouldn't think that this was just a
writer's idea of what
just
it
a
was like.
throwaway thing.
Yeah.
And that's one of the small things I'm talking about, that if you get that order right, or you get the ceremony right, that will touch a military member or veteran in a way that just is a throwaway line or something, or even just the character dying,
That's
more so.
sacrifice. And I think, I'm sitting here thinking about like tropes, or things about, like, basically a military story is the hero's journey in a lot of ways. Like you receive the call to join, you can deny the call, then you accept it, you go through a transition process, right? You go into the underworld or whatever. But the military is one of the few places that acknowledges that. Where in civilian life, when you get out, like, okay, you can have HR can give you a stupid pizza party. But there are very few, like, that's why I've enjoyed, I mean, I've worked, after I left the military, I worked for a police department, and I still work in organizations that acknowledge people, and it's very important to me to acknowledge people. But also thinking about that process of bringing someone into an organization, normalizing them, giving them goals and give the resources to it. I know all those things for me about the military that are the best things about it, trying to apply those to the world. But when it comes to a military story, like those, I think those are the kind of tropes you can get in there that some readers, it'll really resonate with them, and other readers will just see it as progression. They don't think about it. It's now that all these buzz, like, new stories are supposed progression stories. Well, you're just doing the same thing that's always been done. Like in a military story, we advance in rank. We have a great struggle. We learn, we grow, and now that growth is acknowledged with new rank and new responsibilities. And as Jeff likes to say, like, that's the same story that's been told forever, right? But I think in a military story, there are just very specific ways those things are kind of codified, and some people just don't kind of get that. Like, for me, that would also be the difference between a military science fiction story and a story with military ideas in it, because a military science fiction story is going to acknowledge those things and take time with them too. Like, Star Wars, not that Star Wars is military science fiction, but it ends with the award ceremony. And I think that's one of the reasons Star Wars hits as hard as it did at the end, is because they took that moment to acknowledge the sacrifice people had made. But that's just I was thinking about as you were saying that, like,
that's
so
a good note there, because Josh, you gave us a tip on writing military sci-fi. James, you've given us a tip on writing military sci-fi. Rick, do you have one similar? And you could do one, I could do one, and then we could.
Yeah.
Like a tip
for getting the details right.
For getting the details right. You mean like Josh said about reading military nonfiction?
Yeah, but your own.
But no, I'm just saying that's the kind of tip you're looking for, though.
Sure.
Yes.
Well, I've been very lucky in that I have several friends who have a lot of military experience. I mean, I was in the military, but I wasn't in during wartime. Well, I was in the Gulf War, but I didn't go over there. So I have
You've got the
I have
pin.
no experience. I have no experience of being shot at or shooting at other people. Uh, but I have friends that were in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I've talked to them extensively. And if if you don't have anybody who you know personally who was there, uh, there's always friends of friends, relatives. You know, there's somebody knows somebody who was actually saw combat. That's the difference. When I was first in the military, uh, during the Cold War, like James, finding someone who'd actually seen combat was like as rare as hen's teeth. If you found somebody who happened to be in Grenada or Panama, they were like rock stars. You're like, what was it like to be in combat? What was it like to get shot? And nowadays, after Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and all the stuff that went down, it's hard to run into anybody in the military who wasn't in a combat zone at some one point or another. And if you meet somebody who was in the infantry or the Marine infantry or armor, artillery, it's hard to find someone who wasn't in a place where they were getting shot at. Transportation.
This will tell
Our
you how
friend
old we
Jay,
are, man. Like I check out the Army subreddit a lot, and it's already come back around where people are like, "Man, I hate being a slick sleeve. I wish I had a combat patch."
yeah,
Every time I see somebody with a combat patch, and I'm like, "Yeah, when I was in, everybody had a combat patch." So,
yeah. I mean, and a lot of those people are out now, and it's easy to find somebody who's been over there. Even people in transportation. J.R. Hanley was in
Mhm.
transportation, but he saw more action than a lot of guys I know in the infantry because they were getting constantly attacked. Find somebody who's been there, has been shot at, who's had their life in jeopardy, and ask what they were thinking. What were you thinking when it happened? What were you feeling after it happened? How long did that keep living with you? That's the thing that I've been able to figure out from talking to my friends is, in the movies and TV shows, they always make a big deal. Oh, I killed somebody. Oh, I'm going to be haunted forever. Most of them are not haunted by the people they killed. They are haunted by their friends that got killed next to them and the times they almost got killed. Because that's what the people who have nightmares, the people who have flashbacks, they're not thinking, oh, I have a flashback to where I killed this guy. No, they're flashback to where my friend died right beside me, or I got wounded and I thought I was going to die, or the vehicle I was in got blown up and there was this big flash of light and a roar of noise and I thought it was all over. That's the stuff they flash back to. That's the stuff that they have nightmares about. And my son was in Syria and he didn't see direct combat, but the base he was in got mortared, and somebody blew up an IED at the front gate. He still thinks about that. It's still something that, I mean, he doesn't have like PTSD about it, but that memory keeps coming back to him when the explosion happened, when that IED went off at the front gate, and he was in the shower, helpless, covered in soap, and that's the type of thing you can find out from people who are there, and that's, I think, the key to making a realistic, at least infantry style story, is to find out what those people are thinking when they get shot at, when there's people out there trying to kill them, and you react to that. That's the thing that makes for realistic military science fiction, in my opinion.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Being an extrovert, I have no problem walking up to complete strangers and asking them intricate details of their lives. So, what I do is every time I see somebody wearing a hat that is Air Force or Navy or whatever, especially the World War II guys, is I'll chat them up and I'll ask them a very specific question, which is, what is something about your job that you wouldn't know unless you did it? And they always tell me something that's really awesome. Like I talked to this engineer's mate, and he said he was served on a Fletcher in World War II, and his thing is that you never knew you were in combat until it was over.
Mhm.
He was down there working on the engines, super loud. He's got earmuffs on. Things are making noise or whatever. ship's already shaking all the time anyways, and he comes up on the deck and it's on fire and there's bullets everywhere. He didn't know. And
Right.
sometimes people don't know that they're in combat in the Navy. And so it's really interesting to ask those questions, get those little details, and then you sprinkle them in your work. And yeah, just like all these other suggestions, which are all really good suggestions, and I think we do all of them. You get this verisimilitude about a story, and then people reading it, and even if they weren't in the military, you can tell when you're watching or reading something that's true.
Well, that's like my father was in a bomber in World War II. He was a nose gunner, and when I wrote the first book in the Acheron series, which was about basically people who are kind of in future equivalent of bombers, the one thing that I worked in was basically he thought every single time that they took off, he was 100% certain that this was the mission he was going to die on. And it wasn't something like where he was shaking with fear. He just had to accept every time this is the mission I could die on. So that when the time came that they started getting shot at, he wouldn't panic then because he just accepted it.
You already knew he was dead.
Yeah, this is the one I'm going to die on. So just do your job. And that's the same thing with like the people going out in Acheron in these basically missile boats, and they're tiny and don't have much armor, and bunches of them die every time, and they just have to accept this is the one that's going to kill me.
One of the things that we might want to touch on in another episode, something I just thought about that while we're talking about, getting characters right and conversations right, is also the not just the aspect of killing people in battle, but what the body does physically and like biochemical reactions that happen inside the body during combat. Tunnel vision, not being able to work your fingers, you lose fine motor skills,
Audio exclusion.
audio exclude, all that stuff. I was never in combat, but I was an officer, police officer for 15 years now, and I've been in situations where
Well, you have been in combat. You were a police officer.
I mean, that's
true. Okay, granted, different kind of combat, yes. I've had to pull my gun several times. I've been in several fights. I've almost had to shoot a couple of people. And I say that not to toot my own horn, but just to say I've been in those situations, and when they say you train to the lowest level or you react to the lowest level of your training in combat, that's true. And in combat you lose fine motor skills, and that's why when you see people when they reload M4s with the heel of their hand, they're slapping the gun. There are that's because they don't have the fine motor skills to press it with their finger. They're pressing it with their hand. The same thing when if you have a pistol and you are reloading after it locks back, they strip it out, or when they slam it back in, they grab the back of the gun and rack the slide instead of hitting the slide release with their thumb, which in most cases it's not a slide release, it's just a slide lock. But you don't see that a lot in good fiction or in good movies, because hitting that slide release with your thumb under stress is extremely hard. And so grabbing the whole thing and racking it is the best way to train to do that. And so it might be a good discussion to get into about, that kind of realism in those kind of circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely.
Also,
I'd love to talk about the future.
Also, there's been a progression in military training through the decades where it feels like the military is trying more and more to separate the actual act of combat from your knowledge of what's really going on. I mean, not situationally, but the fact that you're actually shooting somebody.
Oh yeah.
They're trying to get you not to think about the fact you're detached. And I'm wondering at some point if you're going to get to the point where you're detached from the feeling of even being shot at.
Well, you're familiar with On Killing by Grossman. Like it's kind of old at this point, but he just touches on the fact that after World War II, they learned that like I think only 25% of infantry even fired their rifles, and so that's why
that ended up becoming. They ended up becoming.
Did they debunk that?
It ended up being debunked. He made up all the statistics.
Oh, that's great.
But I know for a fact
because
that,
it was
like in the Civil War, they have found rifles from the Civil War that were loaded with like 10 bullets
Yeah.
because the person never actually fired their
fired the
rifle.
trigger.
They just kept reloading it.
Well, what
Yeah,
did
he basically wrote his suppositions, and
Uh,
then the army completely changed the way they trained and did stuff, and that's what led to the disaster in army tactics in Vietnam, where you had something like 5,000 bullets fired for every North Vietnamese killed, because they basically were being taught as if they weren't going to shoot their weapons. So all the guys did was lay down and
So that was very well documented in the nonfiction series, The A Team.
well, I was thinking more about, pop-up targets and, basically teaching you to remove conscious thought from the kind of trigger decision.
Yeah,
So,
they try to detach you from the fact you're shooting a person.
mhm. Huh, well, that's too bad. I just gave that book to a guy that's doing research. I gotta find where it was debunked then.
It's good theory, right? It's good
I mean,
theory,
yeah.
but
the
just
idea
like
was sound. He just, he didn't talk to very many people.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
his whole idea that like one out of every 100 troops were actually the ones doing all the killing, and only 20% of soldiers fired their weapon. It's what led to some really bad decisions from the military's perspective on tactics and strategy and new weapons and things like that. It's why they went to full auto, all
Mhm.
weapons full auto, because part of his thing was like all the bar riflemen fired their weapon all the time. Well, of course they did. They had a full auto weapon that emptied its clip or emptied its magazine every 5 seconds. Of course they were firing that, and the ammo was heavy.
Yeah,
They didn't want to carry it back. So yeah,
that's funny. Well, context, right? So
yeah.
thinking about all those things. So, all right, I think we've been it's been about a whole hour now. We did it. Our first episode, we talked.
sweet.
So, please, forgive us as we get warmed up and get deeper into this. I think we'll get better as we go. But this is
Yeah,
a
give us some
conversation.
feedback too. Feel
Yeah.
free to comment what you like, what you didn't like. Tell us if you don't want me on this show anymore, that kind of thing.
No, gotta be
Jeff
on
talks
the
too
show.
much. Get rid of him.
Nobody's off the show. But we'd love to hear about just like Jeff asked, if there are details about your job that you had that no one else would know, we'd love to hear about it.
Oh, that'd be
Also,
cool. Yeah,
yeah.
please do.
And thoughts or ideas for the show. We're getting started. So believe it or not, we have more than a year's worth of, show concepts, but we'd also love to hear what things you'd like to hear
They
about.
all suck.
They're pretty good. They're pretty good. It's all
I'm really
romance.
looking forward. I don't know about you guys, but the show I'm looking forward to the most is the one where we talk about our negative reviews.
Yeah.
That's the one I'm looking
We'll
forward
have to
to.
jump
I
right
can't
into
wait
that
for
one.
that.
We got to
Yeah.
get that one out of the way because I'm really looking forward to the romance and military science fiction episode.
Yeah.
That I can't wait to talk about.
Yes.
Hey, I've got romance in my books.
I know it's my least, not about your books. It's just
The truth comes out.
I
My
like
least
no.
favorite part of your books, Jeff.
I like to say that I do not have romance in any of my books. I have relationships.
relationship. I
Romance and
remember
relationships are different things.
I remember Rick saying that once. He's like, "They're adults. If they want to get it on, they will. Don't drag it out."
Yeah, that's just
And I think about that.
not how people operate in my experience.
I don't know. I've met some people
I
like that.
pretty much have experienced that. Yeah.
So, all right. Well,
People-
thanks for hanging out with us, and we will talk to you next time. So we'll see y'all later.
Bye.
Bye.
Adios.